first thing we uncovered in the ice wasn't the structure. It was a door. Not a hatch, not debris, not some collapsed fragment of an old station. A door. Vertical, steel, rectangular, standing upright beneath nearly 30 feet of compacted Antarctic ice, as if it had been waiting there the whole time for someone to find it again. I'm not a historian, I'm not military, and I'm not one of those people who goes looking for ancient mysteries, because I think the world is hiding Atlantis under every glacier. I'm a subsurface imaging contractor, ground-penetrating radar, thermal anomaly analysis, structural density interpretation. My job is usually simple. Governments and private groups call me in when they need someone to tell them what's under the ice before they start cutting into it. Most of the time it's boring. Collapsed ice tunnels, buried supply depots, old fuel drums. Once in Greenland, we found an entire aircraft wing section from a crash nobody had bothered recovering in the 1960s. That's the kind of work I do. That's why the call I got in early August bothered me immediately. It didn't come through the usual channels. No research consortium, no government office, no university, just a secure transfer request and a short message asking if I was available for a restricted polar recovery consultation, requiring immediate deployment to the Ross Ice Shelf. That alone wasn't unheard of. What made me pause was the pay. They were offering me more for 12 days of work than I'd made on my previous 2 contracts combined. Whenever that happens, it usually means one of 2 things. Either the conditions are so dangerous no one else wants the job, or someone doesn't want questions. I should have ignored it. Instead, I asked for the survey packet. They sent me 4 files. The first was a standard ice density map. The second was a shallow thermal scan. The third was a radar slice. And the fourth was a black and white photograph taken from above, old enough that the corners had degraded digitally where it had been scanned. That photo is what made me accept. At first glance, it just looked like a snowfield, flat and wind-scoured, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, same as half the continent. But in the lower right corner, partially obscured by drift, was the top edge of something geometric. Not rock, not natural shadow, a straight line, then another, then the faint suggestion of an eagle insignia, half buried under snow. I remember staring at it for a long time before zooming in. There was no mistaking it. German. Old German. Not modern Bundeswehr markings. Not some tourist artifact. Not expedition branding. It looked military. And if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this. There should not have been a buried German military structure that deep in Antarctic ice. Not officially. The contract came through less than an hour later. The confidentiality agreement was absurd even by classified standards. Full communication seizure. No personal devices. No off-record note-taking. No independent copies of survey data. A clause stating that historical attribution may be inaccurate or intentionally incomplete, pending strategic review. That line stayed with me. Historical attribution may be inaccurate. In other words, if you see something that doesn't fit the story, keep your mouth shut. I signed anyway. 3 days later, I was on a military transport, leaving Christchurch, with 14 other people, and not one of them looked like they wanted to be there. There were no introductions beyond first names, no insignia on the cold weather gear, no branch identifiers, no unit patches. Everyone had the same blank black equipment bags and the same expression people wear when they've been told enough to be nervous, but not enough to say no. I sat across from a structural engineer named Molina, and a communication system specialist called Hart. Hart looked about 30, maybe younger, and spent most of the flight pretending to sleep. Molina didn't bother pretending. He stared at the floor for nearly 10 hours and only spoke once to ask if I'd seen the image. I said yes. He nodded once and said, "That wasn't the worst part." Then he wouldn't elaborate. We landed at McMurdo first, refueled, then transferred to a smaller aircraft that took us deeper inland toward a restricted zone that did not appear on any map I was shown. From the air, Antarctica is beautiful in a way that feels hostile, too clean, too empty, too final. Everything is either white or shadow, and after a while, your brain starts to lose any sense of scale. A ridge might be 20 feet high or 200. A dark patch might be exposed to stone or a hole deep enough to kill you before you hit bottom. We touched down on a temporary runway marked by black poles and heat lamps, then transferred by tracked vehicles for another 4 hours through open white nothing. No chatter, no scenery, no landmarks, just wind, engine noise, and the feeling that we were heading somewhere nobody talked about, unless they had to. We arrived just before local dusk, though in Antarctica that word barely means anything. The sky was a dull, bruised gray, and the wind had dropped enough for the camp lights to become visible from a distance. There were 6 insulated structures set up in a rough half-circle around a cut trench in the ice, all connected by flagged guidelines and temporary heating cables. Floodlights had been positioned around the excavation site, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the shape of the dig. It wasn't wide, it was precise. A rectangular shaft cut down through the ice in clean, measured sections, with reinforced wall panels and ladder platforms at regular intervals. This wasn't a fresh discovery. They'd already been working on it, and whatever they'd found down there, they'd stopped just short of opening it. A woman in a heavy black parka met us as we climbed down from the transport. No insignia, no visible rank. Mid-40s maybe. Narrow face, pale eyes, the sort of expression that looked permanent. She introduced herself as Dr. Eliza Voss and said she was the operations lead. Not who she worked for, not what agency this was, just operations lead. She brought us into the main structure where the heat hit hard enough to sting and gave us the briefing, standing beside a digital display showing layered scans of the site beneath the ice. This location, she said, was identified after a glacial shear event exposed subsurface metallic signatures inconsistent with known survey records. Initial assumptions suggested buried aviation wreckage or a fuel storage cache associated with early 20th century expeditions. She tapped the screen. The image shifted. There it was again. That door. Only now I could see more of it. Heavy steel, recessed frame, thick hinge mounts, and above it, just barely visible beneath ice abrasion and mineral staining, an insignia that made the room go completely still. A Reichsadler, Nazi eagle. No one said anything. Voss let the silence sit there before continuing. We have reason to believe this structure predates all officially documented permanent German activity in the region. That was bureaucratic language for, this should not exist. She moved to the next scan. It showed the structure extending downward, and that's when my stomach turned over, because the door wasn't attached to a bunker. It was attached to a shaft, a deep one. The walls dropped vertically through the ice and into something below it, something large enough that the radar return blurred into a dark cavity we hadn't fully mapped. Depth to first chamber is approximately 62 meters, Voss said. Internal geometry below that remains incomplete due to signal distortion. How incomplete? Molina asked. Voss looked at him for a moment before answering. Incomplete enough that we need you. Then she zoomed in on the lower scan. At first I thought the image had glitched. There were shapes beneath the first chamber, angular and overlapping, too clean to be natural, but too distorted to interpret properly. Then I realized what I was looking at. More structures, not one buried site, a complex, something bigger beneath the first level, much bigger, and around the edges of the deepest return, there were strange interference blooms, as though the radar signal was being bent or swallowed before it could resolve properly. That shouldn't happen in ice. It shouldn't happen in rock either. What are we opening tomorrow? Hart asked quietly. Voss didn't answer straight away. Instead, she looked around the room at all of us and said something that made the atmosphere change immediately. We are not the first modern team to access this site. That got everyone's attention. She clicked again. A new image came up. This one was much older. A photo from the late 1950s, judging by the film stock and the clothing. Snow tractors, canvas gear, American by the look of it, and behind them, partly excavated from the ice. The same door, the same insignia, the same shaft. My mouth went dry. What happened to them? Someone asked. Voss turned the screen off. Then she said very calmly, "That's what we're trying to determine." Nobody asked the question out loud after that, but it was sitting there in the room anyway. If another modern team had already reached the site, then why was it still buried? Why wasn't there a station built over it, or a plaque, or at the very least some dry classified explanation about Cold War retrieval programs and geopolitical disputes? Why had they cut down to the door, then covered it all back up and left it there for decades? Voss didn't elaborate, and none of us were in a position to force her to. She dismissed us after the briefing with a simple schedule for the morning entry, then reminded us that all movement outside designated zones required escort clearance and that no one was to approach the shaft alone. That last part sounded routine. It didn't feel routine. The camp itself was too polished to be temporary, but too stripped down to be comfortable. Everything inside the modules had that same anonymous quality I'd already noticed on the flight. No flags, no logos, no paperwork left lying around. Even the coffee tins had their labels removed. I ended up sharing a bunk unit with Molina and Hart, and for the first half hour, nobody said much. You get that on certain jobs, especially when people are still trying to work out what kind of danger they're actually in. There's a strange etiquette to fear among professionals. Nobody wants to be the first one to sound worried, so everyone acts bored instead. Hart lasted the shortest. When he thought Molina was asleep, he asked me, quietly, if I believed the "not the first team" line. I asked him what else it would be. He lay there a few seconds before answering. "A warning," he said. I didn't reply because I didn't want to encourage the conversation, but the truth was I'd already been thinking the same thing. What Voss had told us didn't sound like context. It sounded like liability. At around 0200 local time, I woke up needing to piss, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was. That happens in field camps. You come out of sleep and your brain still thinks you're in a hotel or at home or anywhere, except inside a metal box, on the deadest continent on Earth. Then I heard the wind against the outer shell and remembered. The module was dark, except for a strip light over the door, and both Hart and Molina looked asleep. I pulled my boots on, shrugged into my thermal layer, and stepped out into the corridor, leading toward the sanitation module. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the clear flap into the operations room, Someone was standing with their back to me, looking at the excavation feeds. At first I assumed it was Voss, but the shape was wrong. Broader shoulders, slightly taller. I slowed down, mostly because the person wasn't moving at all. Not shifting weight, not adjusting stance. Just standing there, perfectly still in front of the monitor glow. Then the screen changed. The camera angle on the shaft rotated automatically to one of the lower wall views, and the person stepped aside, just enough for me to see what had drawn their attention. There was frost, spreading across the inside of the steel door. Not outside, not the ice around it. The door itself. It had been clear and dark in the briefing images, but now there was a white film blossoming outward, from the seams and hinges in branching patterns like veins under skin. It was subtle enough that I might not have noticed it if the camera hadn't been zoomed so close. I took another step forward. The person at the monitor turned. It wasn't Voss. It was one of the engineers from the flight. Reese, I think his name was. Heavy-set guy, close-cropped hair, looked older than the rest of us and meaner too. He looked at me for maybe a second, then jerked his chin toward the screen. "You seeing that?" he asked. I said yes. He rubbed at his face with one hand and said, "That wasn't there an hour ago. Equipment issue." He gave me a look that said he'd already considered that and dismissed it. Then he leaned closer to the monitor and said something under his breath. I nearly didn't catch. "It's colder inside." That made no sense. The ice outside was sitting under deep Antarctic surface conditions. The shaft walls had to be maintained thermally just to let people work down there safely. Nothing about the internal side of the door should have been dropping faster than the surrounding environment, especially if the lower structure had been sealed for decades. I moved up beside him and studied the feed more carefully. There was something else, very faint, a smear low on the left side of the frame, just at the edge of the recess where the door met its housing. Not frost, not shadow, something darker. I asked if they'd sent anyone down after lights out. Reese said no. Then he reached over and switched camera angles. The next feed showed the floor platform in front of the door from a higher position. Whatever the dark smear was, it wasn't on the camera lens. It was on the steel, a handprint. Not crisp, not fresh, not dramatically obvious, but visible enough that once you saw it you couldn't mistake it for anything else. 5 long finger marks, streaked downward slightly, as if someone had pressed their hand there and then dragged it lower. I felt something tighten in my stomach. "Could be old," I said. Reese didn't answer. He just clicked to the archived still from 2 hours earlier and put it beside the live feed. The handprint wasn't there before. Neither was the frost. We both stood there looking at it, and that's when the low-level alarm sounded. Just one sharp tone from the operations console. Not a camp emergency alarm, system notification. Reese moved before I did, pulling up the diagnostics. One of the thermal probes mounted on the lower shaft wall had spiked down by nearly 9 degrees in under 3 minutes, then flatlined. A second probe did the same while we watched, then a third. The trend line looked wrong in a way that took me a second to process. It wasn't random cooling, it was moving. A cold front, narrow and distinct, traveling upward through the shaft from somewhere below the first chamber. Reese whispered, "No." Not dramatic, not panicked, just a quiet refusal, like if he said it softly enough reality might reconsider. He hit the internal comm and called for Voss. It took less than a minute for half the camp to be awake. Voss came in wearing half-zipped thermal gear and no expression at all, which somehow made her look more alarming than if she'd seemed rattled. She took one look at the screen and told Reese to pull all lower feeds, thermal overlays, and pressure readings. As the data populated, the room got quieter and quieter. The cold wasn't just moving, it was following a route. It came up through the shaft, paused at the level of the door, spread across the steel, then continued higher into the upper wall sections before dispersing, like breath, like something exhaling against every surface as it rose. Voss asked if anyone had gone below platform level since 1900. No one had. She asked if any external environmental systems had malfunctioned. They hadn't. She asked if anyone had tampered with the lower cameras. Nobody answered, which was answer enough. Then Hart, who had arrived last and still looked half asleep, said the thing none of us wanted, said aloud, "What if the door isn't sealed from our side?" No one responded to that either. Voss shut the monitor bank down, one screen at a time, until only the live feed of the door remained. Then she turned to the room and said we would proceed with the opening at 700 as planned, but with revised entry order, and no one was to discuss what we had just seen outside the mission structure. Melina actually laughed at that, one dry, ugly sound. "You think that's the problem?" he asked. Voss looked at him for a long second and said, "The problem is panic before we understand the system." Then she sent everyone back to their bunks. No one slept after that. At 0640 we suited up and moved to the shaft in full cold weather gear, with auxiliary lamps, sealed instruments, atmospheric readers, and enough breaching equipment to open a bank vault. The wind had dropped overnight, and the air outside had that eerie stillness Antarctica gets when even the continent seems to be listening. Under the floodlights, the excavation looked deeper than it had the night before. Not physically deeper, psychologically. A rectangle cut down into darkness with steel ladders and platform rings disappearing one under another until the lower levels were swallowed by shadow and electric light. We descended in pairs. Hart and I went third, behind Melina and a cryotechnical supervisor named Yates. Reese came after us, then the medic, then Voss, last with 2 security personnel I hadn't seen during the flight briefing. They were armed. That was new. No one commented on it. The shaft walls were colder than they had any right to be. You could feel it even through the gloves, a dry, biting cold, radiating inward from the ice, despite all the heating cables, fixed at intervals along the supports. At around 20 meters down, I looked across at one of the embedded instrument panels and saw frost, thick along the casing. At 30, the lower air changed. Not smell exactly, density. The sensation you get when stepping into an old underground space, somewhere enclosed too long, where the atmosphere has been isolated from weather and life and daylight. For so long, it no longer feels part of the same world. By the time we reached the final platform in front of the door, my fingers had gone numb inside heated gloves. The steel surface was rimmed white now, not lightly but heavily, every seam and contour outlined with frost, thick enough to look painted on. The handprint we'd seen on the feed was still there too, clearer in person than it had been on screen. A long streaked mark on the left side of the recess at about chest height. I crouched to examine it and immediately wished I hadn't. The fingers were too long, not by much, just enough. Enough that when I raised my own gloved hand beside it, the difference was undeniable. Melina saw it too. He didn't say anything, but he stepped back from the door slowly and kept his eyes on the mark in a way that told me he'd reached the same conclusion. Whatever had put that hand there, it wasn't wearing gloves, and it hadn't come from our side. Voss ordered the thermal cutters brought forward. Yates mounted the first unit against the welded external locking braces, half buried along the right edge of the frame, and sparks began hissing out across the platform. As the torch bit into the old metal, something answered from the other side. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single, unmistakable knock from within the door. Everyone stopped. No one looked at each other, because no one needed confirmation. We had all heard it, Voss said, very quietly. Continue. And Yates, to his credit, did. Yates didn't speed up after the knock. He didn't slow down either. That was the most unsettling part. He just kept the torch steady against the welded brace, sparks fanning out in a controlled arc as the old steel softened and split under the heat. If his hands were shaking, I couldn't see it through the gloves. No one spoke. No one asked what that sound had been, because there are moments where asking the question makes it worse, where giving something a name turns it from a possibility into a fact. So we stayed quiet and let the cutter do its work. The first brace gave way with a dull metallic snap, the severed section dropping against the platform with a heavy clank that echoed up the shaft in a way that felt too loud, too exposed. Nothing came from the other side this time. No second knock, no movement, just that same dense, wrong stillness pressing outward from behind the door. Yates shifted to the next weld. As he worked, I found myself watching the frost on the steel instead of the cutting line. It had changed again, though I couldn't say exactly when. The branching patterns had spread farther across the surface, thicker now, almost layered, and there were faint, clear patches forming between them, like something warm had brushed against the metal, from the inside and melted sections back to bare steel. Not random, not uniform, localized, at about shoulder height. I stepped closer before I could stop myself. The metal there wasn't just clear, it was damp, condensation, which meant whatever was on the other side of that door was warmer than the ice, much warmer. Temperature? I asked. Reese checked his reader. Rising, he said, then paused. From inside. That shouldn't have been possible. 60 plus meters under Antarctic ice, sealed for decades. No known power source, no airflow, no thermal exchange pathway. It should have been dead cold in there. Instead, it was heating. The second brace snapped. This time, the sound from inside came almost immediately after. Not a knock, a shift. A heavy, sliding movement like something adjusting its weight, just beyond the threshold. Hart inhaled sharply beside me. I didn't look at him. I didn't want to see his face, because if he looked the way I felt, it would have been enough to make me step back and call the whole thing off. Voss didn't. She watched the door like it was a problem she intended to solve. Last brace, she said. Yates moved to the final weld. The torch flared brighter as it bit in, molten metal, dripping in slow glowing beads down the frame. The frost nearest the cut line melted instantly, running in thin rivulets that froze again a few inches lower, where the ambient temperature dropped off. Then something pressed against the door from inside. Not hard enough to move it, not enough to bow the steel, just enough to be visible. A shape, flat at first, then curving slightly as pressure increased. A hand. I don't know why I knew it was a hand. Maybe because of the angle. Maybe because of the way the condensation smeared outward in 5 distinct directions. Maybe because some part of the brain recognizes patterns like that before logic can interfere. It stayed there for 3 seconds. Then it slid downward, slowly, leaving a clear track through the frost. Yates didn't stop cutting, but his breathing changed. You could hear it now over the hiss of the torch. Too fast, too shallow. He finished the cut. The final brace separated and dropped away. For a moment, nothing happened. The door remained shut, heavy and silent in its frame. Then a low mechanical groan sounded from somewhere inside the structure, deeper than the door itself, like a system responding to a release it had been waiting on for a very long time. The handle on the right side of the door shifted, not turned, moved, just a fraction, like something testing it. Yates stepped back. No one told him to. He just did. Voss raised one hand. "Stand by," she said. Her voice was steady. That was worse than if it had cracked. Reese moved to her side, instrument panel in hand, scanning for pressure changes, atmospheric variance, anything that might give us a hint of what we were about to expose ourselves to. "Internal pressure is stable," he said slowly, as if he didn't trust the reading. "Oxygen present, no toxic signatures." "How long could that last sealed?" Hart asked. Reese didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. It couldn't, not for decades, not for even a fraction of that time. Voss stepped forward and placed her gloved hand on the door. The frost beneath her palm melted instantly. She didn't react to the temperature difference. She just leaned in slightly, as if listening. We all waited. For what? I don't know. A sound, a movement, a confirmation that whatever was on the other side was either gone or something we could understand. Instead, what we got was worse. A voice. Not loud, not distorted, not even particularly strained. Clear enough that every one of us heard it the same way. "Don't." It came from inside the door. Calm, measured, human. My throat went dry instantly. No one moved. No one spoke. Because that single word had just done something none of the physical evidence had managed to do. It had removed all doubt. There was something alive in there. Something that could speak. Something that had just chosen to. Voss didn't step back. If anything, she leaned closer. "Identify yourself," she said. There was a pause. Then the voice came again. Closer this time, right against the steel. "You shouldn't have come back." The wording hit harder than the tone. "Come back. Not come here. Not open this. Come back." Meaning whoever or whatever was inside believed this had already happened. Voss didn't hesitate. "Who is this?" she asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Then very quietly. We tried to seal it. A cold sensation moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the environment. We, past tense, tried, not succeeded. "Open the door," Voss said. For a second I thought she was responding to the voice. Then I realized she was talking to us, to Yates, to the security team, to the entire group. The decision had already been made. No one argued, because we all knew why we were there, and because the kind of people who fund operations like this don't accept hesitation once you've reached the objective. Yates and Reese moved into position. They didn't touch the handle. Instead, they attached the mechanical spreaders along the seam, locking them into place where the braces had been cut. Hydraulic pressure built with a low whining sound. The steel frame resisted at first, then shifted. A thin line opened along the edge of the door, just a few millimeters. Enough. Cold air didn't rush out. Warm air did, thick, stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that reminded me immediately of old machinery and something else I couldn't place. The gap widened. The frost cracked and fell away in brittle sheets. The door groaned as it was forced outward, the hinges screaming in protest after decades of disuse. And from the darkness inside, something breathed. Not loudly, not aggressively, just a slow intake of air, as if whatever was in there had been waiting for that first opening, waiting for the first exchange, waiting for us. The door opened another inch, then another, until finally, with one long tearing sound of metal against metal, it gave way enough to reveal the interior beyond. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then the light from our lamp spilled in, and I realized the corridor inside the structure wasn't empty. It was lined with bodies, standing. No one went through the door, not at first. We just stood there on that steel platform under 60 meters of Antarctic ice, staring into a corridor full of dead men who looked like they'd been waiting for us. The first thing my brain registered was the uniforms. Dark wool, heavy collars, old-style cold weather gear, stiffened with age and dry mineral residue. Some had armbands, some didn't. Most were too damaged or too obscured by decay and frost to make out clearly. But there was enough left to understand what we were looking at. German, wartime, or close enough to it. There were at least a dozen visible in the first section of corridor alone, maybe more behind them, where the light fell off into shadow. Every one of them was upright, positioned shoulder to shoulder, along both walls like they'd been ordered to stand there and never moved again. None of them looked peaceful. A few had their heads tilted sharply, as if they'd died mid-turn. One had both hands pressed against his own throat. Another was missing most of the lower half of his face, not in the way decay does over time, but like something had split the tissue and then left it to freeze that way. I heard Hart swear under his breath. Molina didn't say anything. He just took one slow step backward, like his body had reached a conclusion his mouth hadn't caught up to yet. The corridor itself was wider than I expected, maybe 10 feet across, steel-lined, but not in the crude utilitarian way you'd expect from a wartime bunker. The walls had reinforcement ribs and conduit channels, yes, but there was also something else built into the design. Curved recesses, repeating geometric insets, and a strange layered pattern in the metal that looked almost decorative until you stared at it too long. The floor wasn't dusty. That bothered me immediately. It should have been. If this place had been sealed since the war, the air should have been dead, and the surfaces should have carried decades of fine residue. Instead, the steel floor beyond the threshold looked clean, not polished, not actively maintained, but untouched in a way that made it feel recent, as if things here didn't settle the way they should. Voss was the first one to move. She stepped over the threshold without hesitation, lamp raised, boots ringing softly against the steel floor. The sound carried farther than it should have, echoing down the corridor in a long metallic ripple that seemed to wake the space around us. Nothing reacted. Nothing moved. So the rest of us followed. Crossing that threshold felt wrong in a way I can't explain cleanly. The temperature changed first. Not colder, not warmer exactly, just more stable. The air inside the corridor had none of the shifting hostility of the shaft outside. It felt held, preserved, like stepping into a sealed museum display, built for a climate no one alive had ever intended to recreate. And then there was the smell, old oil, dry rust, faint antiseptic, and underneath all of it, something sweet and rotten that didn't belong in a place this cold. We advanced slowly, past the first line of bodies. Up close, they looked even worse. This wasn't a corridor where people had died naturally after being trapped. These men had died under stress, extreme stress. I don't mean fear, though there was plenty of that frozen into what remained of their expressions. I mean physiological breakdown, ruptured capillaries, blackened fingernails, splitting skin at the corners of the eyes and mouth. One of them had both palms pressed flat over his ears so hard the fingers had cut into the tissue and stayed there. The medic crouched beside that one and muttered something I didn't catch. Then he looked up at Voss and said, "No gunshots, no obvious trauma, no bullet damage." Melina gestured at the man with the ruined lower face and said, "That looks like trauma to me." The medic shook his head. "Not external." I remember that exact phrase because it made me feel physically ill. Not external, as if whatever had happened to them had started inside their own bodies and forced its way out. We kept moving. The corridor extended maybe 40 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Along the left wall, just before the opening, were mounted plaques and storage racks, most of them rusted through or empty. The plaques were marked in German Gothic script, much of it corroded beyond readability. But Hart photographed what he could with the secured field unit, while Reese scanned for active systems. Then Reese stopped walking. "What is it?" Voss asked. He held up his instrument panel without taking his eyes off it. "I'm getting current." No one responded immediately because the statement didn't make sense. Then he repeated it. "There's power here." That changed the air in the corridor more than the bodies had. Because dead soldiers in a buried wartime site are one thing. Horrifying, yes, but explainable within certain boundaries. Power is different. Power means function. Power means continuity. Power means this place wasn't just a grave. It was still a system. We reached the chamber entrance and the light from our lamps spread outward across a room that looked part military operations center, part industrial machine hall, and part something else I still don't have the language for. The first thing you noticed was the scale. It was far larger than the radar slices had suggested, with a ceiling high enough to swallow the beams of our lamps before they reached it cleanly. Catwalks crossed overhead. Steel platforms descended in levels around a central recessed floor. Machinery lined the walls in silent blocks and columns, some recognizably German in design, heavy riveted housings and analog gauges, and some not recognizable at all. That second category is the part I still think about, because mixed in among the generators, relay boxes, cable trunks, and pressure tanks were structures that didn't belong to any era I knew. Smooth black casings built into the walls like growths, rather than installed units. Panels with no seams. Recessed surfaces that looked like metal, until the light hit them, and they reflected like stone. German engineers had clearly brought things here, but they had also built around things that were already here. And once you noticed that, you couldn't stop noticing it. The room had been adapted, not constructed from scratch. The walls beneath the visible steel skin were not bunker walls. They were older. Cut stone maybe, or some mineral surface, worn smooth by age, and then overlaid with 20th century machinery in an attempt to make it legible. The central floor section was ringed by equipment stations and cable runs, leading down toward a circular opening in the middle of the chamber. Not a pit. Not exactly. More like a shaft cap, with a grated metal platform installed over part of it and monitoring rigs clustered around the perimeter. Several of those rigs had toppled. Others had been torn loose. One lay upside down 20 feet away with its cables stretched and snapped as if it had been dragged. That's when Hart called us over to the right wall. There, mounted beneath a cracked glass panel, was a board of old paper logs and typed sheets, preserved by the dry air. German, mostly, but clipped among them were later additions. English, typed on American military forms from the late 1950s. My stomach tightened immediately. The photograph Voss had shown us in the briefing hadn't just been from some survey team that found the place and left. They had come inside, and they had stayed long enough to document things. Hart started reading the English entries aloud while the rest of us spread out around the room. The first pages were routine enough. Environmental notes, mechanical observations, personnel count, atmospheric composition. Then the language changed. It became fragmented, more urgent. I remember one line exactly because it was typed in all caps. No further personnel to lower platform, without visual confirmation. Another, audio events continue in shaft, despite power isolation. And then one that made every hair on my body lift at once. The Germans were not locking it out. They were locking it down. No one said anything after that. No one needed to. Because all at once, the logic of the place rearranged itself. The welded braces on the outer door, the upright bodies in the corridor, the layered systems from different eras, the American presence, the fact that the site had been reburied after discovery. This wasn't a lost bunker, it was a failed containment site, and we had just opened it. That's when the room lights came on, not all at once. One row first, low and amber along the far wall, then another above us, then a thin ring of pale recessed light around the circular opening in the center of the chamber. No one moved, no one breathed for a second, because nobody had touched anything, and yet, the chamber had just responded to our presence. Reese looked down at his panel and whispered, "Current spike." The ring of light around the opening brightened. Then, from somewhere deep below the grated platform, something knocked back. 3 slow metallic impacts from far down in the shaft beneath us. Not random, not settling. Patterned, measured, like an answer. The 3 knocks came again. Not louder the second time. Closer. That was somehow worse. The sound traveled up through the shaft beneath the chamber floor, with a depth and clarity that made it feel less like an echo, and more like something ascending through a hollow space, in measured stages. 3 impacts. Pause. 3 again. Then silence. No one said a word. The only sounds in the chamber were the soft electric hum of systems that had apparently just decided to wake up, and the increasingly audible breathing of everyone around me. Hart was the first to move. He stepped away from the logboard and closer to the central opening, keeping well back from the ring itself, while angling his lamp downward, through the grated section. "What do you see?" Voss asked. "Nothing," he said immediately. Then after a beat, "No, not nothing, just depth." That was an odd way to put it, but I understood what he meant the second I looked. The shaft beneath the grate should have behaved like any enclosed vertical space. Our lights should have caught a wall, a support frame, a lower platform, something to give scale and distance. Instead, the beam just went down and kept going. There were walls, but not in any way my eyes could settle on cleanly. The surface below seemed to absorb the edges of the light rather than reflect it. It wasn't black exactly. More like the geometry itself was hard to hold. Imagine shining a torch into a place where the angles don't quite behave. "That's the closest I can get." The medic muttered, "No. Not to anyone. To the shaft. Like if he refused it quietly enough, it would stop existing." Voss ignored all of that and moved back to the English records, reading faster now. I joined her. Most of the pages were field notes from what appeared to be a U.S. Navy or intelligence recovery team in 1958. Some entries were technical, some personal, and a few had been manually redacted with thick black marker that had bled into the paper. Over time, the unredacted portions were bad enough. One entry described subsurface architectural continuity inconsistent with exterior footprint, which is a fancy way of saying the inside was larger than the outside should have allowed. Another noted that German engineering adaptations appear secondary to pre-existing cavity and non-human substrate. That phrase stood out immediately. Non-human substrate, not unknown rock, not foreign alloy, non-human, as if someone had already reached the point where geological explanations had failed. Then I found the first handwritten page. American, judging by the phrasing, probably from whoever had taken over command after the original survey phase. The handwriting was rough but legible. We are hearing movement below lower ring at all hours, not random. It responds to footsteps above. Men have begun refusing descent unless sedated or accompanied. 2 attempted to sabotage the lift controls this morning. I kept reading. German notes translated today. They were not excavating. They were sent to monitor and report changes after prior breach event. Original access predates expedition. Their personnel losses began after lower aperture was exposed. They believed the structure beneath the station was sensitive to attention. I read that sentence 3 times. Sensitive to attention. I wanted to dismiss it as stress language, the kind of phrase people start using after too much isolation and not enough sleep. But the chamber around us made that difficult. Everything about the place felt reactive, as if observation itself mattered down here. Molina joined us at the wall while Hart and Reese kept working around the central opening. "Find anything useful?" he asked. I handed him the page. He read it in silence, then looked toward the shaft and said, "That's not a phrase I ever wanted to see in an official document." Neither did I. Boss was already pulling another set of records from a lower rack. These older and more damaged than the first. German this time, but Hart had enough of the language to translate rough passages on the fly. He took one look at the first page and said, "This isn't scientific." "What is it?" Reese asked from across the room. Hart didn't answer immediately. He just kept reading with a frown that slowly deepened. Then he said, "It reads more like observations from a quarantine unit." That word changed the room again. Quarantine. Not expedition. Not survey. Quarantine. Hart translated one of the pages out loud while we worked. It was dated 1941. The original German was clipped and formal, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Lower aperture remains active despite thermal suppression and auditory isolation. Personnel assigned to Ring B report recurrent dreams prior to symptom onset. Subjects continue to describe voices using familiar names and personal memories. Recommendation remains unchanged. No direct response to vocal mimicry. The medic looked up sharply from one of the bodies he'd been examining near the wall. Vocal what? Hart read the line again. No direct response to vocal mimicry. No one said anything for a second. Then, from somewhere behind us in the corridor, a voice said, "Daniel." I turned so fast I nearly slipped. No one had called me Daniel since I was a teenager. My family uses Dan. My colleagues use Mercer. No one on this expedition even knew my first name, unless they'd read my file closely enough to bother memorizing it. The corridor was empty, except for the dead. No movement, no visible source. Just the open threshold and the line of frozen German soldiers, still standing where we'd found them. My chest had gone tight enough to hurt. "Did you hear that?" I asked. The silence that followed told me they had, but not in the way I expected, because Hart frowned and said, "Hear what?" That made my stomach drop. I looked from face to face. Molina was staring at the corridor too, but not where I was looking. He was focused farther left, eyes fixed on a dead officer near the entrance. "What did it say?" he asked. The room seemed to narrow around me. "What do you mean? What did it say?" His face changed slightly as he looked at me. Then he said very carefully, "It said my wife's name." No one moved after that. The chamber was suddenly too small, too close, too aware. The medic took 2 steps back from the nearest body. Reese actually laughed once, but it was the wrong kind of laugh, the kind people make when their brain is trying to escape before the rest of them can. Hart went pale and said, "Nobody respond." No one had to tell me twice. The problem was, now that it had happened once, every tiny sound in the room felt loaded. Cable ticks, metal settling, breath through masks. All of it started sounding like the beginning of a voice. Voss, to her credit, or maybe her insanity, stayed focused. She didn't react much to the corridor incident beyond saying, "No isolated movement. No one leaves visual contact." Then she moved to a control pedestal near the shaft ring and started assessing the old power interface with Reese. The pedestal was partly German and partly retrofitted by the American team, with later wiring spliced into older conduit and labels layered over labels in 2 languages. Most of it was dead. One section wasn't. A narrow panel near the base glowed faintly when Reese touched it, not with the warm amber light of the chamber systems, but with a colder white-blue illumination that didn't look 20th century at all. The symbols on that panel were not German. They weren't any language I recognized. Not runes, not engineering notation, not military shorthand. Geometric, repeating, and too regular to be random. Reese scanned it and swore under his breath. "What?" Voss asked. "It's outputting something," he said. "Power. No, sequence." That got my attention immediately. Sequence means intention. Sequence means information. He adjusted the scanner, then angled the panel so the rest of us could see. The symbols were changing, not cycling randomly, progressing, a repeating set of patterns advancing 1 stage every few seconds, as if the system had entered some kind of startup process the moment the outer door was opened. "How long since it activated?" Voss asked. Reese checked the timestamp. "It started exactly 31 seconds after we crossed the threshold." Melina looked at the shaft and said, "That feels bad." It did. Very bad. Because now we had a place built around a lower opening nobody fully understood. Bodies from at least 2 separate eras, written warnings about voices using personal memories, and a system that had just begun doing something the second living people entered the chamber again. That's when the lights overhead dimmed, not failed, dimmed, as if power had been diverted elsewhere. The ring around the shaft brightened in response, and from far below us, deeper than before, something moved. Not a knock this time, a long mechanical sound, ancient, massive, like a lock turning somewhere underneath the earth. The sound from below lasted maybe 6 seconds. That was all. But in those 6 seconds, every person in that chamber stopped what they were doing and listened the same way prey animals do when they hear something too big moving just out of sight. It wasn't the sound itself that got to me. It was the scale of it. You could hear metal in it, yes, but also weight, depth, a kind of deliberate resistance, as though some enormous mechanism somewhere below us had shifted one position after sitting motionless for a very, very long time. Then it stopped. The chamber lights steadied, and for a moment, nobody said anything at all. Then Reese did something I would have slapped him for if I'd been standing closer. He leaned over the ring and dropped a steel tool into the shaft. I didn't even realize what he'd done until I heard the first clink. It hit something on the way down, then another surface, farther below, then silence swallowed it before we got anything useful from the descent. No clean bottom, no satisfying impact, just depth again. Hart looked at him like he'd just kicked a sleeping dog. "What the hell are you doing?" "Testing the return," Reese said, though his voice lacked conviction. Voss didn't even turn around. "Don't improvise again," she said. He didn't reply. Instead, he kept staring into the shaft with the kind of fixed attention that makes people look less like they're observing something and more like they're listening for it to answer. Melina pulled me aside toward the wall of logs, while the others stayed clustered around the central opening. "You noticed it too, right?" he asked quietly. "Noticed what?" He looked toward the shaft, then back at me. "That sound. It didn't feel like it came up." I frowned. "What?" He lowered his voice further. "It felt like it moved sideways first, then up." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. That was exactly why the sound had felt so wrong. A normal shaft transmits vertically. Echo, resonance, mechanical transfer. You hear things rise or fall in a way the brain can place. This hadn't behaved like that. It had felt like something below us wasn't simply beneath the opening. It was connected to a much larger horizontal space. A network, maybe, or a chamber, far larger than the shaft cap suggested. And suddenly, the words from the old American log made more sense than I wanted them to. Subsurface architectural continuity, inconsistent with exterior footprint. The inside was bigger than it should have been. A lot bigger. Hart joined us with another set of translated German notes and spread them across an old equipment table under one of the still functioning wall lights. These pages were in worse condition than the others, brittle and darkened around the edges, but they had been stored in sealed sleeves, and enough of the text remained legible to piece together the sequence. At first, it looked like routine station procedure. Personnel rotations, temperature logs, equipment failures. Then, about halfway through the stack, the tone changed abruptly. There was a sketch on one page, rough but unmistakable, a circular chamber, a ring platform, a central shaft, and below it, drawn in heavy black pencil, a much larger shape extending downward and outward, beyond the limits of the page. Not a machine, not exactly. More like a structure made around emptiness, layered, nested, deliberate. Beside it, in German, a phrase Hart translated twice, before he seemed willing to trust his own interpretation. It says, he stopped, frowned, then started again. It says the lower structure is not an object. That made none of us feel better. "What does that mean?" Reese asked. Hart turned the page. Next line says, "It is an arrangement." I still remember how that word landed. Arrangement. Not bunker, not chamber, not reactor. Arrangement. Like whatever was down there had not been built for a single purpose we'd recognize, but configured, positioned, designed around relationships between spaces and forces rather than human use. There were more notes beneath the sketch. Hart translated as he went, slower now. Initial access occurred after subsurface collapse during thermal boring. Aperture discovered below pre-existing ice cavity. Personnel losses began after acoustic response event. He flipped to the next page. Exposure to lower chamber produces recurrent auditory intrusion, dream repetition, memory displacement, and mimic response. Recommendation from Berlin remains unchanged. Station not to be abandoned under any circumstances. Monitoring must continue. That line was bad enough. The next one was worse. The structure does not appear dormant when observed. It becomes dormant when ignored. Nobody said anything after that, because that sentence didn't just sound strange. It sounded intelligent, not the writing, the thing being described, as if the people down here in the 1940s had already concluded that whatever they found was affected by attention in ways they could observe but not control. Voss took the page from Hart and read it herself. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw something crack in her expression. Not panic, recognition. That bothered me more than anything else, because it meant she hadn't come here blind. She'd expected at least some of this. "What did they open?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to another stack of materials farther down the wall, these stored inside a sealed German steel case, with the eagle insignia scratched off so aggressively the metal had gouged inward. The case wasn't locked anymore. Inside were folders, a cracked leather notebook, several reels of degraded recording tape, and a bundle of folded blueprints. Reese and I helped her lay the blueprints out across the table. At first glance, they looked like station schematics. Then I realized only the upper levels were man-made additions. The rest of the drawing wasn't construction, it was tracing. The Germans hadn't designed the lower levels, they had mapped around them. The top section showed the entrance corridor, the chamber we were standing in, the shaft ring, the machinery, the observation stations. Below that, the lines changed. No measurements in standard units, no room labels, just concentric structures, descending around an expanding void, all centered on a lower region, marked only with repeated warning symbols and one handwritten phrase in red pencil. Hart leaned over my shoulder and translated it in a whisper. Keen fundament. No foundation. I looked at him. That can't be right. He nodded once. It says there's no base. I stared at the blueprint again. The lower structure didn't terminate. The mapped layers just kept descending beyond the page boundary, and at the edge of the final visible level, there were directional arrows pointing inward from multiple side corridors that had no corresponding entrances in the levels above, which meant whatever was below us wasn't just deep, it was extensive, potentially extending laterally through the ice or underlying rock, far beyond this chamber, a whole buried system, maybe older than the station, maybe older than the ice. That's when the leather notebook fell open. Voss had picked it up while we worked, and apparently loosened the spine enough that one of the pages slipped free and landed face up on the table. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in German, but far more personal than the official logs. The ink had bled in places, but Hart read enough of it to go quiet halfway through. "What?" Melina asked. Hart swallowed. "It's from one of the officers." "About what?" Hart hesitated, then read aloud. "We believed at first that the voices came from below. We were wrong. They come from inside the men, after they've been near the aperture. The lower arrangement does not speak into the room. It speaks through what has already entered it. That put a very specific kind of fear into me, because suddenly, the voices in the corridor weren't just creepy environmental phenomena. They were contamination, a transmission, a process. And if the Germans had understood that 80 years ago, then the upright bodies lining the entrance corridor made horrible new sense. Those men hadn't been placed there ceremonially. They had been kept there, quarantined where they died, or positioned where they stopped. The notebook continued. Hart's voice got quieter the more he translated. By the 6th week, none of us trusted speech after dark. Men repeated private phrases spoken only in dreams. One technician addressed me in my dead brother's voice while asleep, and did not remember doing so upon waking. We began isolating the affected in the entrance corridor. It did not stop the imitation. The medic took 2 steps away from the table and said, "No." Again, Just that one word. He was saying it a lot now. Not to us. To the idea that any of this could still be unfolding around him in real time. Then the ring around the shaft flashed once, hard enough to throw sharp shadows across the chamber walls. Every light in the room dipped. And from somewhere below, deeper than before, something answered with a sound that wasn't mechanical this time. It was a voice. Not close. Not human. And every single one of us heard it say something different. I knew everyone heard something different because of the way they reacted. If it had been one clear sound, one shared phrase, we would have looked toward the shaft with the same expression, the same recognition, the same fear. We didn't. Hart flinched and grabbed the edge of the table like someone had hit him. Reese turned halfway toward the corridor as if he'd heard the voice behind him, instead of below. The medic actually whispered, "Mom?" before he caught himself, and the shame that crossed his face after that was almost worse than the fear. Molina didn't move at all. He just went completely still, staring into the shaft with a look I'd only ever seen on people when they recognized something they never wanted to hear again. Voss was the only one who didn't visibly react. Or maybe she was just better at hiding it. "What did it say?" I asked. No one answered. Not immediately, because answering would have meant admitting what we'd just heard, and I think some part of all of us still wanted to pretend it had been static, stress, fatigue, anything except what it obviously was. Then Reese said, "Nothing." Too fast, too flat. A lie so obvious it almost made the room feel worse. Hart looked at him and said, "Bullshit." Reese snapped his head toward him. "Then you say what you heard." Hart didn't. None of us did. That silence was the moment the team changed. Up until then, we'd all been scared of the place. Now we were starting to get scared of what the place might be doing to us. And once that happens on a remote job, once trust starts cracking even a little, things go bad quickly. Voss cut through it before it could spiral. "No further speculation," she said. "From this point on, no one responds to any voice or sound that cannot be physically sourced and confirmed by 2 people minimum. Nobody moves alone. Nobody leaves the chamber without escort. If you hear something personal, you say nothing until we document it in pairs. Understood?" Nobody liked being spoken to like that, but nobody argued either, because it was good protocol, and because it implied she had been briefed for this exact scenario before we arrived. That stuck with me. The fact she already had rules ready, not general field safety rules, specific ones, as if someone, somewhere, already knew what this place did to people. Reese muttered, "We should reseal the door." That got everyone's attention immediately. Voss turned to him slowly. "We haven't completed the survey." "I don't care," he said. "You heard the logs. You heard whatever the hell that was. We have enough to tell whoever sent us that this place needs to stay shut." He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. Any sane person should have agreed with him. But Voss didn't. She just stood there beside the old German schematics and said, "We are here because the site reactivated without external contact." That changed the room completely. Reese frowned. "What?" She looked around at all of us once before continuing. The thermal bloom that exposed the upper door wasn't caused by glacial movement. It came from inside the structure. Nobody spoke, because that meant this wasn't just some buried relic we had disturbed by accident. It had already started doing something before we ever got here. She kept going. 3 months ago, a satellite pass detected cyclical heat output under this section of shelf. Low amplitude, repeating. That output increased over 12 consecutive scans. By the time the surface fracture exposed the upper structure, internal temperatures had already risen beyond projected equilibrium. "Why didn't you tell us that before?" Melina asked. "Because you were hired to assess, not interpret," she said. That answer went over exactly as badly as you'd expect. "Assess what?" he snapped. "A bunker? A machine? A grave? What exactly did you think we were walking into?" Voss held his stare for a second too long. Then she said, "A recurrence." That word landed harder than anything else she'd said. Not anomaly, not activation, recurrence. Meaning this had happened before, more than once. Hart was the first to say it. "The Americans didn't rebury this place because they couldn't study it," he said quietly. "They buried it because they'd already seen enough." Voss didn't deny it. That was answer enough. The medic had moved away from the table entirely by then and was standing near the corridor entrance, breathing too fast, one glove pressed against the side of his helmet like he was trying to block something out. I walked toward him slowly and asked if he was all right. He looked at me like it took him a second to recognize who I was. Then he said, "Did you hear it again?" I hadn't. Not yet. But the way he asked told me he had. "What did you hear?" I asked. He shook his head hard. "Nothing. Same lie as Reese. Only this one was worse, because I could see he wanted to say more and was actively stopping himself. Before I could press him, the chamber lights dimmed again. This time, not briefly. They dropped to half power and stayed there. The ring around the shaft brightened in response, casting a pale upward glow that made everyone in the room look sick. Then one of the bodies in the corridor fell. The sound was awful, not because it was loud, but because it was so normal. A dead human body losing balance and hitting steel after standing upright for decades should not be a normal sound. But it was. A flat, ugly impact, followed by the scrape of frozen fabric across the floor. Every head in the chamber turned instantly. The body lay partly in the corridor light, one arm twisted beneath it, face turned away from us. No one moved. No one wanted to be the first to go near it. Then Hart said something I didn't catch. He was looking past the fallen body, not at it, beyond it. I followed his line of sight. At first I thought one of the other bodies had shifted in the bad light. Then I realized the problem. There was one more standing there than there had been before. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. But I had counted them without meaning to when we first entered, the same way people count exits in unfamiliar spaces. 2 on the left, before the wall rack. 4 more on the right. 3 at the far narrowing near the threshold. I remember it because one of the right side figures was missing half its face, and the asymmetry made the line easier to memorize. Now there was another shape between the second and third body on the left. Tall, still, partially obscured by shadow, and I knew with a horrible certainty it had not been there earlier. Reese saw it too. He swore and raised his lamp, flooding the corridor with harder light. The new figure didn't move. It was just standing there, head slightly lowered, hands at its sides, wearing what looked at first like the same old German cold weather gear as the others. Then the light caught the fabric properly. Modern, black, layered, not wool, not 1940s, current expedition issue. My mouth went dry instantly because I recognized the shape of the outer shell. It was ours. No one said anything for maybe 2 full seconds. Then Melina whispered, "Who the fuck is that?" The figure lifted its head, and even before the light found the face, I knew what was wrong. The proportions, the way it held itself, the slight delay between movement and balance, like it had watched people do it and was almost getting it right. Then the lamp beam hit the visor, cracked, frosted from the inside. One of ours, one of the team. Only the face behind the mask wasn't visible. Just a dark shape and a pale blur where skin should have been. The medic made a sound I'd never heard from an adult before. Not a scream, more like the noise your body makes when it realizes something, before your mind can protect you from it. Then the figure spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough to hear. Don't let it use your voice. And I knew that voice, because it was mine. For maybe half a second, nobody moved. That was the problem with moments like that. They don't feel real enough straight away for your body to respond properly. Your mind wastes precious time trying to fit what you're seeing into some sane category. Reflection, misheard audio, stress response, a trick of the light, while the rest of you just stands there waiting to die. The figure in the corridor didn't advance. It didn't gesture. It just stood there in our expedition gear, with my voice still hanging in the air between us like something wet and wrong. Then Reese did the stupidest possible thing. He answered it. "What the hell are you?" The reaction was instant. Every light in the chamber cut out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Gone. Total black. Someone shouted. Someone else stumbled into a table, hard enough to send paper and metal clattering across the floor. Then the shaft ring below us exploded with white-blue light. Not enough to fully illuminate the room, just enough to throw everything into harsh, underlit shapes and moving shadow. In that kind of lighting, human beings stop looking human. Faces become hollows, hands become claws, and the corridor became a wall of silhouettes, not one standing figure anymore. Several, too many, packed shoulder to shoulder between the old bodies, some in German gear, some in ours, all motionless except for small delayed shifts that made them look less like people standing still and more like things remembering how. "Back to the wall," Voss shouted. This time, the fear in her voice was real. That snapped everyone into motion. Training or instinct, I don't know which, but we moved fast, bunching inward near the log wall and equipment tables, so at least nothing could get behind us without crossing the open chamber. The medic was hyperventilating. Hart had one hand clamped over his own mouth, as if he physically didn't trust it. Molina kept his lamp fixed on the corridor, and I'll give him credit for this. His hands were shaking like hell, but the beam stayed steady. The figures didn't rush us. That somehow made it worse. They just stood there in that impossible blue-white underlight, watching. Then one of them stepped into the chamber. Not fast, not aggressively, slow enough that we all had time to see exactly what it was, or rather, what it was trying to be. The build was human, the gear was ours, but the movement wasn't. There was a slight lag in the joints, especially the neck and shoulders, like the body had been assembled around the concept of a person rather than inhabited by one. The faceplate on the helmet was cracked through the center, and behind it I could now see what looked like skin. Only it wasn't right. Too pale, too smooth in some places and split in others, like something had pulled a human face too tight over the wrong structure underneath. And it was smiling, not emotionally, mechanically, just enough to show it had learned that teeth mattered. The voice that came out of it next wasn't mine. It was Hart's. "Don't listen if it says your name." Hart made a strangled sound and took a full step back. The thing tilted its head at him as if it found that interesting. Then from the shaft beneath us came another of those low, impossible sounds. Only this time it wasn't just mechanical. There was rhythm in it, cadence, something almost like speech stretched so deep and slow It no longer belonged to the human range. The thing in the corridor reacted immediately. Not to us, to that. Its head turned toward the central opening in one sharp, unnatural movement, and for the first time since we'd seen it, it seemed uncertain. That uncertainty saved us, because Voss used the moment to shout, "Move now!" And we ran, not out, deeper, which sounds insane until you understand the layout. The corridor to the surface was blocked by those standing figures, and none of us were willing to test whether they were bluffing. The only open route was one of the side access passages branching off the chamber wall, near the lower machinery banks. A maintenance passage, tight, low lit, barely wide enough for two people side by side. But it was open, so we took it. I was third in line behind Voss and Reese, with Melina right behind me, and the others somewhere in the chaos behind him. The passage bent hard after 15 feet, enough to break line of sight to the chamber, but not before I glanced back once. I wish I hadn't, because the figures in the corridor still weren't following us. They were all facing the shaft, and more of them were climbing out. We pushed through the passage in near darkness, boots hammering steel grating, lamps bouncing off old walls lined with frost and cable conduit. The architecture down there changed quickly once you left the main chamber. The German modifications became patchier, more desperate looking. Reinforced support ribs bolted directly into older black surfaces that didn't take welds properly. Emergency signs in German and later English, layered one over another. Cable bundles, fed through wall openings that looked less drilled than cut around. This place had not been built in a single phase. It had been occupied in layers, and every layer had been trying to understand the one beneath it. The passage opened into a narrower control room, with a half-collapsed bank of equipment racks, and another wall of records, this time mostly American. There was also a sealed steel door on the far side marked Lower Access B in faded stencil. The lock housing had been blown apart from the inside. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the blood, old, blackened, sprayed across the wall beside the frame in a fine arc, and then frozen into the paint like lacquer. The medic nearly slipped in it. No one commented. We were past commentary. We barricaded the entrance with 2 equipment carts and a toppled relay housing, while Reese and Hart tried to get power into the room's still functioning console stations. That's when we realized Yates wasn't with us. Neither was one of the security men. We had lost them in the blackout. The second that fact settled in, the room changed, because losing people in a place like that isn't just bad luck. It means the thing you're trapped with has options. Melina wanted to go back for them. The medic wanted to keep moving. Hart was trying very hard not to say what all of us were already thinking, which was that if we went back and found either of them standing in that corridor, smiling through a cracked visor, we were not going to know whether to help or kill them. Then the console in front of Reese powered on by itself. No flicker, no boot delay, just instant pale light across the screen. And on that screen, in clean block text, was a message in English. Not old, not archival. Live. Do not allow it to complete the ascent. Everyone in the room froze. Then a second line appeared. If you hear yourself speaking from outside your own body, do not answer. The medic backed away so fast he knocked over a chair. Reese looked at Voss and said, "You knew this place was active." Voss didn't deny it. That was becoming a pattern. Then the screen updated again, this time with a name. One name, a personnel designation. Lieutenant Ellis Morrow, U.S. Navy Recovery Unit, still contained below ring. The room went completely silent, because that was impossible. A U.S. Navy Recovery Unit had been down here in the 1950s. and according to whatever system had just spoken to us, one of them was still alive. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after the screen displayed the name. It wasn't disbelief exactly. It was the kind of silence people fall into when the implications of something are so absurd that the brain doesn't even know which part to reject first. Still contained below ring, not died below ring, not remains located below ring, still contained. Hart was the first to break the silence. That's not possible. He said it flatly, almost angrily, like he wanted reality itself to apologize for wasting his time. No one disagreed with him, because if a man from a 1950s recovery team was somehow still alive under Antarctic ice after 70 years, then everything we thought we understood about this place had already collapsed. Reese leaned toward the console, scanning for timestamps, process indicators, anything that might tell us whether this was an old automated message triggered by our presence or something live. "What's the source?" Boss asked. "I don't know yet. Can it be faked?" He looked up at her. "By what?" That shut her up for all of 2 seconds. Then she said, "By whoever built the lower systems." I hated how reasonable that sounded, because by then, none of us were operating under the assumption that everything in this place was dead machinery and historical residue anymore. We were in something active, something layered, something that had been waiting. The screen changed again before Reese could dig deeper. A new message replaced the first. Lower access. B remains breached. Then, containment failure, originated at observation tier. That phrase triggered something in Hart immediately. He turned and started rifling through one of the half-collapsed filing drawers beneath the American record shelves, throwing aside cracked binders and warped log folders until he found a stack of blue-backed forms, sealed in brittle plastic. "Observation tier," he said. "I saw that term before." He spread the documents across the nearest intact workbench and started skimming. Most of the forms were typed incident summaries from the American occupation of the site, all stamped with codes rather than proper unit names. A few were too degraded to read fully, but enough remained intact to reconstruct the broad shape of what had happened. And it wasn't what I expected. The Americans hadn't just found the place and tried to study it. They had inherited a disaster already in progress. The Germans had apparently maintained the site in some form through the early 1940s, but by late 1943, their notes became fragmented, contradictory, and then almost entirely absent, except for procedural warnings and repeated references to voice transfer, lower ring response, and subject drift. By 1944, the site had gone mostly dark. No clean end, no final evacuation note, just gaps. Then, more than a decade later, the Americans found it. Hart read aloud from one of the cleaner reports. Recovery Unit 4 entered lower facility on June 11th, 1958. Initial objective was historical and technical retrieval. Site determined to be partially active and structurally inconsistent with previous aerial assessment. Personnel losses began after lower access B was reopened. He looked up. "That's this room." I glanced at the blown-out lower access door on the far wall and felt something unpleasant move through my chest. The Americans had come here, exactly here, and whatever had happened next had happened on the other side of that door. Hart kept reading. Observed effects included auditory mimicry, identity confusion, delayed echo phenomena, and non-local vocalization using familiar internal memory structures. He lowered the page. "That's one hell of a sentence." No one laughed, because by then we'd all lived enough of it to know exactly what it meant. The thing below didn't just imitate voices. It used what was already inside people: private memories, names, grief, recognition, anything that lowered the threshold between hearing and believing. The medic had moved to the far side of the room by then and was sitting against the wall, with both hands pressed against his helmet, like he was trying to physically keep his thoughts inside. I asked if he was all right. He looked up at me, and for one horrifying second I thought he was going to answer in someone else's voice. Instead, he just said, "I keep hearing my daughter laugh." That shut everyone up instantly, because there's no professional response to that. There's no protocol line for, "My child is in the walls." You either admit you understand the horror of it or you don't, and all of us did. The console pinged again. Reese almost jumped. New text populated on the screen, this time in a different format. Not a warning. A log playback index. Ellis Morrow. Audio interview / status review. December 4th, 1958. There was a single file option beneath it. Play. Nobody touched it for a second. Then Voss said, "Do it." Reese hesitated, then pressed the key. At first all we heard was static, then a man's breathing, old recording quality, magnetic hiss under everything, but definitely breathing. Labored, uneven, very close to the microphone. Then a voice, male, mid-30s maybe, American, exhausted in a way that made my own body tense up instantly. "This is Lieutenant Ellis Morrow," the voice said. "Fourth retrieval cycle. If this playback is active again, then they reopened the upper seal." The room went still, every single person in it listening. The recording continued. "I'm making this because the command staff are gone and there's nobody left to sign off on anything. If anyone reaches this room after us, you need to understand something before you go lower." There was a pause, then a sound in the background of the recording, a metallic impact, 3 knocks, the same pattern we'd heard from the shaft. I felt my skin crawl instantly. Morrow kept talking. "The Germans were wrong about one thing. It doesn't want to get out." He stopped, took a shaky breath, then continued, quieter. "It wants to be completed." That sentence landed like a physical object in the room. No one reacted immediately, because none of us understood it. Not fully. The recording went on. "The lower structure isn't a chamber, it's a process. That's why the geometry doesn't make sense, and why the sound doesn't behave right. It isn't built for occupation. It's built to change whatever enters it into something it can use." The medic stood up so fast he nearly hit his head on a low conduit line. "No," he said. "No, no, no." But Morrow wasn't done. "It starts with voices because voices are efficient. Recognition lowers resistance. Once it can map enough of a subject, it begins externalization. You'll think you're hearing things around you. You're not. You're hearing yourself being arranged outside yourself." The entire room felt colder, not physically, conceptually, as if the air had just made room for a new kind of horror. I looked at the blown-out door marked Lower Access B, and suddenly understood why the blood around it looked the way it did. Why the corridor figures had seemed almost right, but not quite. Why the thing in my voice had warned us not to let it use our voices. The process wasn't possession, it was replication, or something worse than replication. Morrow's voice dropped even lower. "We tried to destroy the observation tier after the first 3 externalizations. Charges failed, power rerouted. The lower arrangement defended itself. We sealed ring access and moved survivors up 1 level." There was another pause, then one sentence that made me feel physically sick. "By the time we understood that it could make copies before the originals were dead, it was too late." No one spoke after that. Not while the recording played on. Not while Morrow's breathing filled the room. Not while the tape hissed around his next words like frozen rain. If you're hearing this, then I'm either still below, or it wants you to think I am. Then the tape cut out. Silence. Absolute. The kind that has weight. Reese slowly looked away from the screen. Hart looked like he was trying not to throw up. The medic had gone white enough to look embalmed, and Melina, who had said very little since we entered the site, looked at Voss and asked the only question that mattered now. Did your people know any of that before we got on the plane? Voss didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Then, from the other side of the barricaded passage behind us, someone started knocking. 3 slow impacts against the steel. Pause. 3 again. And then, in Yates' voice, "Open up. It's me." No one moved toward the door. That was the only thing we all got right, immediately. Because after the recording, after everything we had just heard about voices and copies and externalization, there was no version of reality where opening that door without thinking was a good idea. The knocking came again. 3 impacts. Pause. 3 more. Then silence. Yates's voice followed, calm but strained. "Come on, open it. We got separated in the blackout. I've got Ellis." That last part hit harder than anything else. I felt it ripple through the room, that moment where hope tries to force its way in even when every other instinct is screaming against it. Ellis, the name from the log, the man from 1958, still contained below Ring. If there was even a 1% chance that voice was telling the truth. Melina took a step toward the barricade before he caught himself. "You said he might still be alive," he said to Voss, not taking his eyes off the door. "I said the system reported it," she replied. "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. Behind the door, Yates spoke again. "Mercer, it's me. You were right about the frost patterns. It's warmer below than it should be. We need to move. Now." My stomach dropped. That wasn't generic. That was specific. Something I had said earlier. Something only someone who had been there would know. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. "Did you tell him that?" Hart asked. "Yeah," I said. "In the shaft, before we opened the door." Hart swallowed. "That doesn't mean it's him." No, it didn't. That was the problem. Everything the voice said could be true, and still not be him. The knocking started again, harder this time, less measured, more urgent. "Open the door," Yates shouted. "He's not going to last. I've got him here, but something's wrong with the lower level. The structure's changing." Reese shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "No, no, no." "What?" Melina snapped. "That's exactly what it wants," Reese said, backing away from the door. "Information, reaction, movement. It's building a scenario." The medic spoke from the wall, voice thin. "But what if it's not?" That was the question, the one that breaks groups. Because if you get it wrong, one way, you let something in. And if you get it wrong the other, you leave someone out there to die. The door rattled as something hit it from the other side. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to show intent. "Please," Yates shouted. And this time, there was something in his voice that cut straight through logic. Pain. Real or perfectly copied, I couldn't tell. But it sounded right. Too right. "Mercer," he said again, quieter now. "You know me. Open the door." My hand had already moved before I realized it. Not to open it, just closer. Like my body had taken a step my brain hadn't approved. That's when Voss grabbed my wrist. Hard. "Don't," she said. I looked at her. For the first time since this started, she didn't look controlled. She looked certain. not guessing, not theorizing, certain. It uses recognition, she said quietly. It builds trust faster than fear. That's how it crosses the threshold. The door shook again, this time with something heavier, something that sounded like a body hitting it from the other side. Then a second voice joined Yates, weak, strained, barely there. Don't. The entire room froze, because that voice was not strong enough to be an imitation. It sounded damaged, real, human. Don't let it. Then silence. Yates again, louder now. He's losing it. Open the door. Melina turned to Voss. If it's actually him, he's already been exposed, she cut in. That doesn't mean we leave him out there. It means he's no longer a reliable boundary, she snapped. That shut him up. Not because he agreed, because the logic was brutal and correct. The thing below didn't need someone to be dead. It just needed access. The knocking stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then something dragged slowly across the other side of the door. A long scraping sound, like weight being repositioned. Then Yates spoke again. But this time, the tone was different. Less urgency, less strain, more even. Okay, he said. A pause. Then very calmly, we understand. That was worse than anything else he'd said, because whatever was out there had just adjusted its approach. The voice continued. You're afraid of letting us in. Not me. Us. We can fix that, it said. The temperature in the room dropped, not dramatically, just enough that I could see my breath for the first time since entering. And then, behind us, the console screen lit up again. New message. No delay. No typing effect. Just instant text. External contact confirmed. Then another line. Containment breach. Imminent. Reese backed away from the screen like it might explode. What does that mean? Hart asked. Voss didn't answer. She was looking at the door, specifically at the frame, at the edges, at the seam. That's when I saw it. The metal wasn't holding, not in a dramatic way. No bending, no cracking, just separation. Tiny, microscopic at first, but real. The edges of the door were pulling away from the frame by fractions of a millimeter, like something on the other side wasn't trying to force it open. It was learning how it fit together. The voice came again. Multiple voices now, layered, not in unison, overlapping. Yates, the weak second voice, and something else beneath them, something slower, something deeper. We don't need you to open it, it said, and then the lock assembly moved, from the inside. The sound the lock made wasn't loud, just a single internal click. Small, precise, mechanical. But in that room, with everything we already knew, it might as well have been a gunshot. Every person there heard it and understood the same thing at once. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't trying to break through. It was figuring the mechanism out. Reese lunged for the nearest equipment cart and shoved it harder against the barricade, while Melina dragged a second relay housing across the floor to wedge the lower edge. Hart moved without being told and started pulling loose cable spools and steel cases into a rough pile against the frame. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't secure, but it was something to do. And in moments like that, people need tasks almost as badly as they need exits. The medic didn't help. He had backed himself into the corner nearest the console and was staring at the sealed lower access door on the far wall like he expected it to start speaking next. Maybe he was right. Voss crossed the room and grabbed a heavy emergency lock bar mounted beside one of the old equipment racks, then slammed it horizontally through the handles of the barricaded entrance as an improvised brace. It bought us maybe a few extra seconds of confidence. Nothing more. The layered voices outside the door had gone quiet again. That was almost worse than the threats, because silence meant adaptation. Silence meant whatever was out there was no longer wasting effort on methods that hadn't worked. Then the console chimed once more. This time the screen didn't display text. It displayed a diagram, a simplified schematic of the lower complex. Not the whole thing, just our section, the chamber we'd fled from, the maintenance passage, this room, the blown-out lower access door on the far wall, and beneath all of it, represented by a deeper circular field of concentric rings, something far larger. There were moving indicators on the display, 3 in the corridor outside our barricaded entrance, 1 at the main chamber shaft, 2 more lower down beyond the sealed access point. And then, after a brief delay, a 7th indicator appeared inside the room. No one said anything for about a second because none of us could understand what we were seeing. Then Hart looked up from the screen very slowly and said, "Count us." I did. Voss, me, Melina, Hart, Reese, the medic. 6. Only 6. The room felt like it tilted under my feet because the screen was showing 7, and one of them was already inside with us. Every head turned instinctively, each of us doing the same horrible mental calculation at the same time. Who had been nearest when we ran? Who had spoken least? Who had been out of direct sight for even a few seconds in the dark? No one wanted to say it aloud because the second you do, the group fractures permanently. But it was already happening. I saw it in the way Molina shifted half a step away from Hart, in the way Reese stopped standing near the medic, in the way Voss's hand drifted subtly toward the side holster she had never acknowledged wearing. "System error," Reese said quickly. Too quickly. "Bad red. Old sensor drift." No one looked convinced. Then the screen updated again. The 7th indicator pulsed once, and a line of text appeared beneath the map. "One subject has passed first threshold." The medic made a noise I don't think he realized came out of him. Not fear, exactly. Recognition, as if something inside him had just been named. Everyone looked at him immediately. He saw that happen, and his whole face changed. "What?" he said. "Why are you looking at me?" No one answered because the answer was obvious and ugly. He was the one hearing his daughter. He was the one unraveling first. He was also the one who'd been out of our direct sight, the longest in the chamber before we fled. And if Morrow's recording was even half true, then that mattered. The medic looked from face to face, saw what we were all thinking, and started shaking his head. "No," he said. "No, don't do that. Don't do that to me." The barricaded door behind us clicked again. Another internal movement, a second lock component shifting under pressure from the far side. Voss kept her eyes on the medic. "What have you heard since we got in this room?" He stared at her like she'd slapped him. "What?" "Answer the question." He shook his head harder. "Nothing." Lie, clear as day, and everyone knew it, because by then we all understood the shape of denial down there. The problem wasn't just hearing things. It was the moment you started protecting them, protecting the voice, protecting the connection. That's when the threshold got crossed. The medic took a step backward, then another, toward the sealed lower access door, away from us. "Stay where you are," Voss said. He looked around wildly, trapped between fear and humiliation, and something else I couldn't quite name. Then he whispered, "She said she was cold." The room went dead still. No one moved. No one even blinked. Because once he admitted that, there was no going back. He saw it on our faces immediately. He started crying, not dramatically, not loudly, just silent tears running down a grown man's face inside a freezing buried room under Antarctica, while something on the other side of the door learned how to open locks. "I know she's not here," he said. "I know that, I know. But it sounds exactly like her." The worst part, every one of us believed him. That was what made the place so dangerous. Not because it fooled stupid people, because it fooled people who knew better. Voss took one slow step toward him. "What did she ask you to do?" He looked at her, then away. That was answer enough. "What did she ask you to do?" she repeated. He swallowed hard, then said very quietly, "She said not to let you keep him down there." No one in the room breathed for a second, because that sentence didn't come from random mimicry. That was specific. That implied intention, plurality. Someone or something below us was not just producing voices, it was negotiating. Voss's face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not fear, recognition again. Only worse, because this time it came with guilt. "You know what that means," Hart said to her. She didn't answer. The lower access door behind the medic gave a single deep metallic thud from the other side. Not a knock, an impact. Something down there had heard us too. The medic flinched and turned toward it instinctively. And in that exact moment, before anyone could stop him, he reached for the wheel lock on the lower access door. Not because he decided to betray us, because some part of him thought his daughter was behind it. That's how fast the place worked. Not evil monologues, not obvious possession, just one thought, at the wrong time, wearing the right voice. Molina moved first. He tackled him before he got the wheel half a turn. The two of them crashed into the deck hard, slamming into a steel cabinet and sending old folders and rusted tools across the floor. The medic screamed, not in anger, in panic. "Get off me! She's in there! She's in there!" That sentence did something ugly to the room, because even hearing it made the sealed lower door feel more alive. Like now that it had been acknowledged, it was listening more closely. Voss drew her sidearm, not at the door, at the medic, and said the coldest thing I heard that entire expedition. "If he touches that wheel again, I put him down." For a second, nobody moved. Molina was still pinning the medic to the floor, breathing hard, one forearm jammed across the man's chest, while the medic writhed under him in blind panic. Voss stood over both of them with the pistol level and steady, not shaking, not bluffing. And that, more than the gun itself, is what made the moment feel so final. She meant it. If he went for that wheel again, she would shoot him. The medic saw that too. You could watch the reality of it arrive in his face all at once. The fear changed, stopped being abstract and turned immediate, human, simple. He went still, not calm, just still enough to survive the next few seconds. Then the barricaded entrance behind us shuddered. Once, hard. Something heavy had hit it from the corridor side. The relay housing we'd wedged against it scraped backward an inch across the floor. The lock bar groaned under the strain. No one looked away from the medic at first. That was the problem. We had too many threats now and not enough eyes. Then the console chimed again. 3 sharp tones. Everyone flinched. New text filled the screen in a dense block, faster than before, as if whatever system was talking to us had decided it no longer had time for polite formatting. Reese got there first and read aloud automatically before his own brain could stop him. First threshold equals vocal bridge established. He swallowed, then kept reading. Second threshold equals spatial doubling. Then, third threshold equals identity dispersion / ascent, viable. The room went completely still, because even if the wording was clinical, the meaning wasn't hard to understand. First, it gets into your head through voices. Then it starts making versions of you in space. Then, you stop being one person, and once that happens, whatever was below can come up. No one wanted to say that aloud, but we all arrived there anyway. Hart stepped up beside Reese and started scrolling through whatever old buried interface had surfaced under the warning text. "There's more," he said. The system had opened a hidden archive panel underneath the threshold definitions. Some of it was corrupted, some encrypted, some cross-referenced to things that meant nothing to us. But one section was clean enough to read. Observation, tier notes, Imaro. Hart opened the first entry. It wasn't a recording this time. It was a typed field summary, dated 3 days after the earlier audio log. He read it aloud. Subject degradation does not occur uniformly. Some personnel begin repeating external phrases in sleep before exhibiting awareness of intrusion. Others remain lucid, but become unreliable in reflected space. Mirrors, glass, polished surfaces, and shadow edges appear to increase event density. He stopped, then read the next line slower. We have confirmed at least 2 instances where personnel were observed simultaneously in separate parts of the facility before either version showed overt distress. That landed like a punch, because that meant the copies weren't just hallucinations, at least not always. Something was being made, or projected, or arranged, to use Morrow's word. The medic made a sound from the floor and tried to sit up again. Molina shoved him back down. "Don't," he snapped. The medic wasn't even really fighting him anymore. He was staring at the console over Molina's shoulder with the wide, hunted look of someone who has just found out their own thoughts might not be private. "I didn't tell it anything," he whispered. No one answered, because none of us knew if that mattered. The lower access door behind him gave another heavy thud, then a scraping sound, not random this time, rhythmic, like metal moving over metal in a controlled circle. Everyone in the room turned toward it. The wheel lock was rotating, not quickly, not enough to open, just moving a few degrees at a time, under pressure from the other side. I don't know why that scared me more than the voices. Maybe because it was mechanical, objective, no room for interpretation. Something down there was physically trying to come through. The console updated again, this time with a procedural warning. If second threshold is confirmed, do not trust numerical consistency of personnel. Hart read that twice, then looked up and said, "What the hell does that mean?" I answered before anyone else could. "It means stop counting people." That was the ugly logic of it. If the place could produce copies or partials or whatever those things in the corridor were, then headcount stopped being a comfort and became a trap. You could have 6 people, or 7, or 5 and something wearing 6. And the more you tried to verify it, the more attention you fed into the system, which, if the German notes were right, only made it worse. Reese backed away from the console like it was contagious. "No," he said. "No chance. We seal this room and get back to the shaft." "Through what?" Hart snapped. "The corridor full of copies? We can't stay here." He was right. That was the worst part. We couldn't stay. The barricaded entrance was being tested from one side. The lower access door was being worked from the other, and according to the only surviving documentation we had, the longer we remained in the structure, the worse our chances of remaining singular became. Voss finally lowered the pistol. Though she didn't holster it, she looked at the console, then at the lower access wheel, then at the old American records spread across the bench, and she said something so quietly, I almost missed it. They never contained what was below. Hart looked at her sharply. What? She kept staring at the lower door. They contained the path. That changed everything, because suddenly, the station, the Germans, the Americans, the welded outer door, the barricades, the ring chamber, all of it made horrible new sense. Nobody had ever locked the thing away. They had built and rebuilt layers of obstruction around the route it used to come up. The place wasn't a prison, it was a choke point. And if that was true, then every human team that had ever come down here had not been a research unit. They'd been maintenance, temporary hands trying to keep a process from completing. That's when Hart found the photograph. It was clipped inside the back of one of Morrow's field reports and must have slipped loose when we dumped the file stack earlier. Black and white, American era. 7 men standing in this exact room. Only the thing that froze me wasn't the room. It was the men. One of them was Ellis Morrow. I knew immediately because the back of the photo was labeled, and standing beside him was Dr. Eliza Voss, not just someone who looked like her. Her, same face, same eyes, different haircut maybe, different clothing, but unmistakably her. From a photograph taken in 1958, the entire room seemed to pause around that discovery. Hart looked from the photo to Voss and back again. No one spoke for maybe 2 full seconds. Then Reese said the only possible thing. "What the fuck are you?" The lower access wheel turned another inch on its own, and Voss, still staring at the photo in Hart's hand, said, "That's why it knows me." No one spoke after she said that. Not because we didn't have questions, because we had too many. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls had shifted inward without moving, like the space itself had decided it didn't need to pretend to be stable anymore. Hart was still holding the photograph, his hand visibly shaking now. He turned it slightly, angling it so the rest of us could see more clearly. 7 men, cold weather gear, American markings, and Voss, standing just off-center, looking straight at the camera with the same expression she had now. Calm, controlled, completely out of place. "That's impossible," Reese said. It wasn't disbelief, it was rejection. The kind you reach for when accepting something would force everything else to fall apart. "You don't look a day over 40, Molina added, voice tight. The math didn't work. It couldn't. And yet, there she was, on that photograph, in a place that should have been sealed before most of us were born. Voss finally looked up. Her eyes moved across each of us once, like she was taking inventory. Not of our equipment, of us. "I told you," she said quietly. "This wasn't the first recurrence." "That doesn't answer anything," Hart snapped. "No," she said. "It explains everything." The lower access door gave another heavy impact behind the medic. This one stronger, more force behind it. The wheel turned another few degrees with a grinding sound that made my teeth ache. We didn't have time for this, but we didn't have a choice either. Because whatever Voss was, whatever she knew, it had just become the most important piece of information in the room. "You were here?" I said. Not a question, a statement. She nodded once. "Yes." "When?" Molina asked. Her eyes flicked briefly to the photograph in Hart's hand. "December 1958. The room went dead quiet again, because now she wasn't denying it, she wasn't deflecting, she was confirming it. Reese took a step back like he'd been physically pushed. "That's not possible." "I've heard that a lot," she replied. Hart held up the photo. "You were part of the American recovery team?" "No." A pause. Then, "I was what they brought back." That hit harder than anything else. The words didn't make sense at first. Not cleanly, but the shape of them did. And that shape was wrong. What does that mean? I asked. Voss didn't answer straight away. She looked toward the lower access door, toward the slow, steady rotation of the wheel, then back at us. When the Americans reopened the site, she said, they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Not fully. They thought it was a buried installation with anomalous properties, something they could study, control, maybe even weaponize. That sounds familiar, Reese muttered. She ignored him. They established observation protocols, rotations, isolation measures, standard containment logic. Which failed, Hart said. Yes, she replied, because they assumed the process required direct contact. The room seemed to lean toward her. Every word mattered now. They thought the voices were the first stage, she continued. They weren't. The voices were just the easiest part to detect. By the time you hear them clearly, you've already crossed the first threshold. I felt something cold move through my chest, because that meant we're all ready. Yes, she said. No hesitation, no comfort, just truth. You've all crossed it. The medic made a broken sound from the floor. Molina swore. Reese just stared at her like he was trying to decide whether to shoot her or himself. Hart whispered, "Then what are we?" Voss looked at him. For the first time, there was something in her expression that might have been sympathy. "Still yourselves," she said. "For now." The lower access wheel jerked another inch. Faster this time, the grinding sound deeper, closer. "What happened in 1958? I asked. She took a breath. Slow, measured, like she'd answered this before. 3 of us reached the lower tier, she said. We believed we were still observing. We weren't. We were being mapped. I thought of Morrow's voice. It starts with voices because voices are efficient. What happened to the others? Molina asked. They tried to leave, she said. And you didn't? A small pause. Then, I couldn't. That answer landed wrong, not because of what it said, because of how it was said. Not regret, not fear, something else. They brought you out, Hart said, holding up the photograph again. That's you with them. After. Yes. How? Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said the thing that made the entire room feel like it dropped out from under us. They didn't know which one I was. No one spoke, because there is no immediate response to that, no clean way to process it. Just the slow, creeping understanding that whatever had come up from below with them had looked human enough to pass. They quarantined us, she continued. Separated, tested, monitored. 2 of the 3 failed within the first 48 hours. Failed how? Reese asked. She met his eyes. They stopped being singular. The medic started shaking again, harder this time. What about you? I asked. She held my gaze. I remained stable. For how long? Her answer was immediate, long enough to be released. That explained too much, and not enough. The lower access door slammed from the inside. Hard. The wheel spun another fraction. We didn't have time to unpack this. Not properly, not safely. But one thing was clear now. Voss wasn't just part of the mission. She was part of the system, a survivor, or something that had survived as her. Why bring us here? Molina demanded. If you already knew? Because it started again. She cut in. Sharp. Final. The heat bloom. The reactivation. The system doesn't wake up randomly. It requires conditions. Input. Attention. She gestured around the room. We are part of that input. That made something click into place, in a way I didn't like at all. We didn't just find this place, I said slowly. No, she replied. You needed us to open it. Yes. The word hung there. Clean. Unapologetic. Reese laughed. A short, ugly sound. You brought us here to feed it? To complete the cycle before it completes itself uncontrolled, she said. That's the same thing. No, she replied quietly. It isn't. The lower access wheel spun faster, a full quarter turn now. The locking pins inside the door started to retract, one by one, loud enough to hear. Something below was very close. Hart looked at the console, then at the diagram, then back at Voss. What happens at the third threshold? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at all of us. Really looked, like she was memorizing us. Then she said, "It stops needing you to be separate." The lock gave a final, heavy click, and the lower access door opened from the inside. The lower access door didn't swing open all at once. It eased inward, slowly, smoothly, as if whatever was on the other side understood perfectly well that speed wasn't necessary anymore. A thin seam of darkness appeared first, then widened. No rush of air, no dramatic reveal. Just the sight of a black opening beneath the old American warning stencils, and the sound of something moving in the space beyond, with deliberate, measured control. Everyone in the room had already backed away by the time the gap was wide enough to see through. Except Voss. She stood exactly where she was, gun still in hand, not aimed, just held, like even she didn't know what the weapon was supposed to mean down here anymore. I remember thinking, in that stupid detached way the brain sometimes gives you under extreme stress, that the thing about real terror is how quiet it is when it finally arrives. Because once the lower door opened, no one screamed, no one shouted. We just watched. At first, I thought the movement in the doorway was one person. Then I realized it wasn't moving like one. There were too many layers to it. Too many limbs entering and withdrawing from view in the same space. Too many overlapping silhouettes, occupying the threshold in ways that didn't fit normal depth. Then one shape stepped clear enough into the room for the light to catch it. And it was Yates. Or close enough to him that my body reacted before my mind did. Same height, same build, same expedition gear. Only the proportions were wrong in all the places you don't notice immediately, but your nervous system does. The arms a little too long, the shoulders too loose, the head turning just slightly too far before the rest of the body followed. And behind the cracked visor, there was more than one face trying to sit in the same place, not layered visually, layered structurally, like features were sliding in and out of alignment beneath the skin, deciding in real time which version of human to settle on. It took one step into the room, then another, and with each movement, the overhead lights dimmed a little more, while the pale glow from the open lower access behind it grew stronger. The thing stopped just inside the threshold and looked at Voss. Not us. Her. And when it spoke, it didn't use Yates' voice. It used hers. "You stayed away longer this time," it said. No one moved. No one breathed. Because whatever this was, it knew her. Not as prey, as history. Voss raised the pistol. Not fully, just enough to make the intent visible. "You're not crossing," she said. The thing in Yates's shape tilted its head slowly, then smiled, and I saw, with a kind of numb revulsion I still feel in my teeth when I think about it, that the mouth didn't open from the correct place. The skin parted too high, like it had remembered the function of a smile, but not the architecture. "Crossing already happened," it replied in her voice. Then it looked at the rest of us, and I understood in one sickening instant what it meant. The first threshold wasn't a warning. It wasn't contamination. It was arrival. The thing below didn't need to climb bodily into the room like a monster in a film. It had already come up in pieces, through names, through memory, through recognition, through us. The Yates shape took another step, then another, and as it moved, I realized something even worse. It wasn't alone. Shapes were gathering in the open lower doorway behind it, not rushing, not emerging like attackers, forming, as if the darkness beyond the threshold was thickening into approximations of people and letting them harden one by one. Some wore German uniforms, some wore American cold weather gear, some wore ours. One of them looked exactly like Hart from the shoulders up, and nothing like him below the chest. Another had no face at all, just a smooth pale front under a hood where features should have been, except for a mouth opening and closing in the wrong place, like it was trying out speech before earning it. The medic broke first, not in a dramatic, heroic sacrifice way. He just made a sound like an animal and ran for the barricaded entrance. He barely got 3 steps before one of the layered voices behind the blocked door called his daughter's name. He stopped instantly. That was all it took. One stop, one hesitation, and the Yates shape moved. Not fast, not like a predator lunging. It just arrived in front of him. The space between them vanished in a way my eyes still refused to reconstruct properly. One moment the medic was turning. The next, the thing was touching his faceplate with one gloved hand. The medic screamed, high and thin and human, and then he stopped. Not because he died, because the scream continued from somewhere else, from behind us. We all turned at once. The console screen had become reflective, not like glass, like liquid black metal, and in it, standing behind all of us, was the medic, smiling, perfectly still, watching his own body in the room. That was the moment I understood what identity dispersion actually meant. It doesn't kill you first. It separates you. The body, the voice, the recognition, the self. It pulls them apart until they can be reused independently. The real medic was still on his feet for maybe 2 more seconds, twitching slightly under the thing's hand. Then his knees gave out. He dropped hard to the floor, and the version of him in the reflective console smiled wider. Melina lost it and charged. I don't know whether he meant to save the medic or just needed to hit something that could still be hit, but he grabbed a steel tool from the workbench and swung it at the Yates shape with both hands. The impact connected. I heard it. A horrible, wet metallic crack that should have dropped any human being. Instead, the thing's head turned 90 degrees with the force, paused there, then slowly corrected back into place, while the mouth widened, not from pain, interest. Then it spoke in Melina's wife's voice, and he froze. That was enough. The thing touched his wrist. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosion of gore, no visible infection, just contact. Melina's whole body locked instantly. Then his face changed, not physically, emotionally, like something inside him had just recognized home. He lowered the tool, turned, and looked at me with absolute calm. Then he said, in his own voice, "It's underneath everything." I'll never forget that sentence, not because of the words, because of the certainty in them, as if in that moment he could see far more of the structure than any of us ever would, as if he understood it now. The room was collapsing into layers of impossible movement by then. The barricaded entrance was shaking. The lower doorway was filling with partial people. The console reflections were no longer matching the room. And Voss finally moved, not toward the thing, toward the console. She shoved Reese aside, ripped open the lower panel beneath the screen, and exposed a manual charge array built into the American retrofit system. Seismic failsafe. Morrow had mentioned charges. He hadn't managed to use them. Voss could. "What are you doing?" Hart shouted. Closing the path, she said. The Yates shape turned toward her immediately. For the first time, it looked alarmed. Not afraid, just urgent. And that was enough for me. Because if it didn't want her doing whatever she was doing, then that was the only useful thing left in the room. I moved, before I really decided to. So did Hart. We slammed into the nearest emerging shapes from the lower doorway, not to fight them. We were way past winning a fight. But to buy Voss seconds. That's all we had left. Seconds. The contact was the worst thing I've ever felt. Not pain, recognition, like touching a body made from all the private corners of your own memory. I heard my father's voice, my ex's laugh, my own voice as a child, things no one should have had access to. It almost stopped me. Almost, but not quite. Hart was screaming beside me, or maybe inside me. It was hard to tell by then. Voss shouted a code I didn't understand. The charge panel armed with a rising mechanical whine. The Yates shape lunged for her, and Reese, who I had honestly thought would fold long before this, stepped in its way and put 2 rounds straight through the visor. The bullets hit. The head snapped back. The body staggered. And then the face behind the cracked shield changed twice in under a second. Yates. Voss. Someone old and skeletal I didn't recognize. Before the whole thing folded inward like a marionette with its strings cut. Not dead. Just temporarily unresolved. Voss hit the trigger. The world below us detonated. Not like a bomb in open air. Like a buried cathedral, collapsing under the weight of a continent. The floor lurched violently. Every light in the room blew white. The lower doorway vanished in a roar of steel and pressure and black dust. The barricaded entrance buckled. The ceiling screamed. And the last thing I remember clearly, before everything became motion and noise and dark, was Voss looking directly at me through all of it and saying, "Don't answer yourself." Then the floor gave way. I woke up in white. Not snow. Not immediately. Ceiling panels. Hospital lights. Filtered air. The kind of clean, artificial brightness that feels offensive after too much darkness. For the first few seconds I thought I'd died. Then the pain arrived. Head first. Then ribs. Then my right arm. Then the full body weight of being very much alive and very much not where I was supposed to be. I was in a medical isolation room somewhere warm enough to make my skin itch. No windows, no visible location indicators, no personal belongings. My left wrist was banded with an ID strip that didn't use my real name. I knew before anyone told me that I hadn't been taken to a normal hospital. A man in civilian clothes came in 6 hours later. Maybe more. Hard to tell in places where time gets sterilized along with everything else. He introduced himself as an incident recovery liaison. Not a title. A curtain. He asked me simple questions first. Name. Date of birth. Do you know where you are? Do you know why you're here? Then he moved to the real questions. Did I hear voices before the collapse? Did I respond to any of them? Did I observe any duplicate personnel after the lower breach? Had I seen Dr. Eliza Voss after the detonation? That last one told me everything I needed to know. They weren't asking because they were trying to understand what happened. They already knew enough. They were trying to work out what had come back. I told them the truth where I could, that I remembered the lower room, the door, the shapes, the voices, the collapse, and after that, nothing clean. That part wasn't fully true, because I do remember one thing after the fall, not visually, not exactly, more like a sensation, cold black geometry unfolding somewhere far below me, and a voice, not spoken, just understood, saying, cycle preserved, surface incomplete. They kept me there 12 days, maybe 13. No clocks, no windows, no mirrors. That last part I noticed on day 2 and never stopped noticing after that. Every reflective surface had been removed or covered. Polished metal replaced with matte composites. Monitoring screens angled away, unless staff were using them. Even the water pitcher was opaque. They were afraid of reflections. That told me Morrow had been right about more than I wanted him to be. I asked about the others. They told me there had been no others, no surviving team, no official record of the site, no Dr. Eliza Voss in any deployment archive I was permitted to access. When I pushed harder, they changed tactics and told me I'd been recovered alone after a crevasse fall during a survey accident. A survey accident. That was the whole official story. The kind of lie built for paperwork, not people. Eventually they released me. Or maybe they decided whatever they were monitoring had stabilized enough to move into the world. That thought still wakes me up sometimes. I flew back under escort. No phone until landing, no laptop, no notes. When I finally got home, my apartment looked exactly the way I'd left it, which should have been comforting. It wasn't, because something was wrong immediately. Not obvious, not dramatic, just familiarity with an edge on it, like the rooms knew me slightly too well. The first real sign came 3 nights later. I was in the kitchen getting water when I caught movement in the dark reflection of the microwave door. Someone standing in the hallway behind me. I turned instantly. Nothing there. When I looked back at the reflection, the hallway was empty. I smashed the microwave with a chair the next morning. I haven't kept reflective surfaces in my home since. No mirrors, no glass furniture, no black screens after dark. Nothing that gives shape back too easily. And still, sometimes I hear things. Not often, not like before, just enough. My name spoken from another room when I know I'm alone. My own voice from the bathroom while I'm in bed. A soft knock under the floor at 3 a.m. 3 times. Pause. 3 again. I looked into Ellis Morrow. Officially, he died in 1961 in a training accident off the coast of Virginia. There's a photograph attached to the archive file. Black and white. Navy dress uniform. Clean haircut. Mild smile. And behind him, in the polished window of the office, where the photo was taken, there's a second man standing in the reflection. Same uniform, same face, looking directly at the camera. Morrow isn't facing that way. He never could have been reflected like that. I checked the image 6 times before I threw the laptop out. As for Voss, I found one thing, just one, an internal procurement memo from 1987 that shouldn't have been accessible at all. Most of it was garbage logistics language, but halfway down the page was a single line authorizing transport of Legacy Containment Consultant E. Voss to a classified polar site under Continuity Protocol, 1987, and the signature approving it was dated, as if that were normal, like nobody involved found it strange, like she'd just kept going. Maintenance. That's what she called it without calling it that. That's what we all were. Temporary hands on a buried process that never really ends. I don't know if the charges destroyed anything meaningful below. I doubt it. If anything, I think we only damaged one route, one path, one throat. Because 3 weeks ago, a geophysical contact I trust more than most sent me a secure message with no subject line and one attachment. It was a thermal scan from eastern Greenland. Deep ice. Remote shelf. No official site. No listed activity. Just a repeating heat bloom under the ice in the shape of a perfect descending ring. And beneath it, a void. When I zoomed in, there was a notation on the edge of the scan. in a format I recognized instantly from the old American records. 3 words: second path, active. I deleted the file, then I emptied the trash, then I smashed the hard drive. And still, last night, while brushing my teeth over a sink with no mirror above it, I heard my own voice from the bedroom behind me. Clear as day, calm, patient, exactly the way the first one had sounded down there. It said, "You only closed the one you saw.